The title that we've chosen for this evening, Where's the Conscience of the Nation, is designed to expose serious discussions about where moral leadership lies in this country. So we welcome you very much. The person who's actually going to chair the discussion this evening is, as I said, Professor Linda Woodhead. She's professor at Lancaster University and she's written very widely on these subjects. So with that, I'll hand you over to Linda to chair this evening's discussion. Linda Woodhead.
Thank you very much, Charles. Charles Clarke, some of you know, has a life in politics, and we may bring you in, Charles, if you don't mind, on political leadership now and again. The USP of these debates is that we bring good and recent research into dialogue with people who are outside academia and who might have views on that research. The line's a little bit blurred tonight because people here do some research and they're also public figures. Our first speaker is Peter Kellner, and he is the president of YouGov, the survey company. So he does an awful lot of research, but he's also a very prominent political commentator with a previous history in journalism. Peter, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and you're going to kick us off tonight.
A few months ago, we gave people quite a long list of people in Britain today and asked which 3 or 4 of these do you believe provides the best moral leadership to Britons these days. And the top 2 by a distance were the Queen and Prince William and Kate. Third was Malala, the Nobel Prize winner. Only when we come to 4th place, just 15%, do we get to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Mind you, he does a lot better than any of the politicians in our list. But generally, if we look at this and some of the other questions we've asked, it seems to me that around 1 in 10 Britons, depending on precisely how you define it, about 1 in 10 draw their moral principles, their ethical guidelines, to some important extent from religion. And around 9 in 10 do not, or only peripherally. I should declare my own personal position. I'm a devout atheist. And personally, I do not believe that ethical or moral principles need to derive from religion. So if I'm to answer the normative question, where should one look for conscience and the ethical principles, as opposed to where historically has one looked or where does the public look today, personally, I would look to things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention and the ethical principles embedded in them, bearing in mind, as I said earlier, that they historically have derived in large measure from religious teachings, but I would like now to decouple our ethical debates and our ethical principles from those religious roots.
Our next speaker is Dr. Eliza Filby. Eliza is an academic, a visiting lecturer at King's College London, and she has just very, very recently published a book called God and Mrs. Thatcher, The Battle for Britain's Soul.
So I want to specifically focus on the idea of moral leadership. And I want to begin by making a contrast, immediate contrast, between 2015 and 30 years before, 1985. In 1985, politics was in the throes of an ideological battle, with the country led by a Prime Minister, as we know, with a clear moral vision and a genuine religious motivation. We too had a Church of England performing its self-appointed role as the conscience of the nation, playing its role in unmasking the social and economic realities of Thatcher's Victorian values. So in 2015, what do we have? Well, politics is no longer in the throes of an ideological war. According to Conservative MP David Willetts, we are involved in a debate that resembles a choice between 2 different types of coffee. We see churchmen once again speaking out, but this advocacy is frequently drowned out by political interjections by those moral sages of the contemporary age, celebrities such as Ant and Dec and Russell Brand. So 2 sources of moral leadership are strong in contemporary Britain, I would argue. celebrity activists and the monarchy. Two are suffering and struggling for different reasons, the political class and faith groups. So the monarchy. The Queen's moral authority, and this is just been reinforced by Peter's reference to the YouGov poll result where she comes up on top. Her moral authority, I believe, does not come and is not sourced from her longevity, although that helps, but from her silence. She leads by example, not by words. Celebrities. Well, celebrities have long been used to endorse products, but they are increasingly endorsing causes and politics. While Christians still make up the majority of the foot soldiers in the realm of charity, causes now require a celebrity as a figurehead to make an impact and galvanise the populace. The Church of England's authority used to derive from an underlying assumption that Britain was a Christian country in culture, if not active belief. This is now an impossible assertion in today's secular and multi-faith landscape. I believe also that the media, particularly the BBC, seem to give the pure oxygen of publicity to extremists, both non-believers and believers, and rarely actually listen to or give voice to the moderate believing majority. This is an extremely dangerous phenomenon as it fuels public suspicion of religion and increases religious illiteracy. Politicians need to rediscover ideas, the media need to rediscover faith, and the church needs to rediscover its voice. Thank you.
Next we have Clifford Longley. Clifford is an author and a broadcaster and a journalist. He currently has a fortnightly column in The Tablet. Clifford.
I don't start my search for the conscience of the nation by looking in any one direction. That's to say, I don't look to one institution, be it church or whatever, or person, be it the Queen or whatever, to answer the question, where is the conscience of the nation? It seems to me it is a much more fluid concept, and it exists in various institutions at various times. And I want to take two, which may surprise you a little bit. The first is Parliament. The second institution I would suggest is relevant in this field, and this would surprise you even more perhaps, is the media. Now, Parliament, in certain circumstances, has certainly called the media to account for its misbehaviour. I'm thinking of the phone hacking incident where it was select committees of Parliament which did most of the work in exposing just what the infamous behaviour of certain newspapers and certain journalists on certain newspapers amounted to. But don't also let us all forget that it was also the media that turned over Parliament in connection with the expenses scandal. So we have these two institutions, both of which are thoroughly flawed, but which operate together to provide us with some sort of moral conversation in which we also can take part, each trying to correct the other. I'm a great admirer of the philosophy of Alistair MacIntyre, who wrote a famous book in the 1980s called After Virtue, where he described how we live in a world where we, if you like, on an archaeological site, where there are remnants of an old civilization that we're quite familiar with, but don't really understand. And the civilization he was talking about was a civilization of virtue, where moral character was a primary consideration, and the virtues, courage, temperance, justice, and prudence, the four cardinal virtues as they were known, are the basic judgment that we apply when we look at misbehavior in public affairs. That is to say, that's how we inform our conscience. And when we say an MP has behaved badly or a journalist has behaved badly, it's by reference to those virtues that we think that. And without those virtues, we would not have a judgment. So, if you like, the collective conscience of the people exists in these different ways, but it is, if you like, a focus for these Aristotelian virtues. Now, these virtues, I don't think, exist without any source. In other words, it's nice to think that they would arise from nowhere. In fact, I think they exist in civil society and primarily in the religious institutions of our civil society, whose job is to pump virtue into secular society. And my view is they aren't necessarily labelled with any particular denomination, because I think you'd find those virtues present in Confucianism, in Islam, in Hinduism, just as much as you find them in Christianity and Judaism. But nevertheless, I do think they have to have an institutional source, which is, as it were, constantly renewing them so that they are present and available to us. So I don't point to any one place as conscience. I think we're all involved in it, and I've described what I think is some of the structural elements in that involvement. Thank you.
Now to Laura. Laura Jana Klausner is Senior Rabbi to Reform Judaism. She's distinguished in lots of ways, but she's distinguished as the only senior female religious leader in this country. Laura, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. We want to know whether you're pumping virtue into society.
I know. Yes, that is a great line, that pumping thing. As a rabbi, I do not claim any special communication or endorsement from God. I'm just a teacher. But I have to say, I don't feel my job is to pump virtue into society, but more to pique people into that discomfort. A wonderful expression about comforting the disquieted and disquieting the comforted. And I love that as a way of defining religious leaders. There's no guarantee that by having a religious title, we suddenly become moral authorities in our nature. We really have to earn it. So I'm going to choose 3 dynamite values, or virtues as you put them, that could be ways that we might measure whether it works. I call these honest, risky love. Are people honest about themselves? They claim to be religious leaders. Do they talk with honesty? Do they say the truth when it's easy and when it's hard? Risks. Admitting as religious people that we're willing to take risks, which is frightening because people won't like you. And often religious leaders are approval junkies. We love love and being approved. Speaking truth to power. This is a religious heritage as well. Love. We talked about honesty and risk. Lastly, love. It sounds fluffy, but it's real. Leading with love and showing empathy is the most potent way of changing people's lives and therefore bringing a message across, bringing transformation into society through love. This dynamic between religious voices and political voices like those can completely change Britain.
Honest, risky love. Are you just talking about religious leaders and people there, or were you going to extend that?
I loved what those bishops did. It was so annoying. It's brilliant. And the more wound up politicians, the letter to the, about what we should do in the election, how annoying that was and how wound up politicians got, fantastic. The more wound up they got, the better. Because it's that dynamic, that tension that brings changes. And most importantly, with power, you have to hold power into account. And I think religious voices can do that.
But why? What gives them the authority? What gave the bishops the authority to poke the politicians?
Well, it's not having a voting constituency. It's the longevity. It's the trust that we, as religious leaders, must work to earn. So there is an assumption, which is not always right, as we know with religious people, of decency, of honesty, of introspection, of time for meditation, of moral integrity, of making your actions match your beliefs. And if they don't, knock us over, hold us into account.
We can't. You're completely unaccountable.
Well,
Unlike politicians, we can't get rid of you, can we?
I actually think that religious leaders need to be just like everyone else and have job descriptions and appraisals and be able to be sacked.
Almost all religious institutions, for almost all of history, have been male bodies keeping down women. Even now, it's great Laura's here, but it's very, very rare to have a religious leader who's a woman in religious institutions.
I mean, interesting as well that you raised the whole issue of women there, because you notice in the poll that Peter told us about, the top 3 are women, if you discount William. It's Kate really that counts, isn't it? And Mrs Thatcher figured prominently. I mean, given that women are disproportionately not in leadership positions, how interesting that women dominate the moral leadership landscape. Is that just chance, or is it telling us something?
Go on.
Go on, Liza.
Just women have a natural integrity, obviously.
So wouldn't it be better?
Men are more likely to be corrupted.
Well, shouldn't therefore religious leaders be women and not men?
Yeah, they probably learn more.
Why do you say that? I don't agree.
Tell me why you don't agree.
Well, because I believe that gender is fluid and it doesn't necessarily define characteristics like that.
Had it been a male monarch king for the last 60-odd years who'd done as well as the Queen, I'm sure they would also have the respect. William and Kate, you know, I think you should leave out of that because it's one man, one woman. Malala's the interesting one.
Yes, very
Why is she there? Because of what happened to her. What happened to her?
Yeah.
Because she was a girl wanting education for women.
Yeah.
And the people who attacked her believed they were doing it in the name of a religious principle. I'm sure none of us in this room would accept the validity of that religious principle, but to the people who did it, it was a religious principle.
Now, I just want to make a point that it seems to me, from my observation, that in most families, the conscience is probably more likely to be a woman than a man. Often it's the wise old heads of the women in the family who know best. And that's a long tradition that's gone back centuries, indeed millennia.
So
maybe that's the attraction of the Queen. She is the wise old female presence in society.
The goddess.
So what goes on with sexism? What is sexism about? It's about projecting qualities according to your gender. And I am very disturbed by this discussion, which I think is primarily a sexist discussion. I don't agree with the grandparents' discussion. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. And it's also projecting, you know, it's sort of the virgin grandmother, you know, she's so fantastic. I don't agree with it. Women are and men are capable of the same. I really believe that. I want to say something about silence.
Can you say, will somebody in the course of this discussion defend the male domination of religious institutions? I would love to hear that argument.
So
We can, but I'm going to have to bring Charles in because he's keen to say something. Charles.
Well, all I was going to say, Linda, in a sense I agree with Laura. I think this conversation is not really in the right place at all. I think what Clifford said, there are many sources of conscience, is the place to start this conversation. Now you then say, well, how do the various institutions match up? And I'll just take the ones that have been mentioned. Politics. Where politics falls down is that if people believe that politicians are not behaving with integrity, that's why the expenses scandal was such a serious issue. I don't think, for example, I wish you were right in a sense, Laura, but I don't think that many politicians gave a toss about the bishop's letter when it came out. I don't think they thought, goodness, we've really got to take account of that. And that may be a bad thing, but I think the reason why that is that the church has lost a lot of their authority to be able to talk on these moral questions. So I think you have to be much more explicit and go through different sources and make an assessment of why they have authority or not. I don't think the woman-man thing, I mean, you can have quite an interesting discussion about it. Some parts of this conversation were interesting from that point of view. But I don't think that's the core issue. The core issue is how have the various sources of conscience behaved or not behaved, and what can they do to behave or not behave better?
Laura, I must admit, I really liked your honesty, risk and courage. I'd like to suggest a fourth and perhaps a change of word for the second. I wonder if it's courage rather than risk. And the fourth I would suggest is humility. I think there's a great moral authority that comes with not seeking the limelight, which is why I feel so uncomfortable with celebrity. But applying that to the church as an institution, I'd like to pick up on what Charles has asked or suggested. Has the church lost its moral authority because perhaps it's not seen as being honest, it's not seen as being courageous or indeed as loving on many key social issues, sexuality being one of them?
And so the interesting question to ponder, and you've already touched on it, is the way that religious leaders are not in touch with their own followers, and that the views of, for example, Anglicans on issues, on many issues, are completely out of kilter with their own religious leaders. Their values may not be, but the question is whether religious leaders speaking out on specific political issues actually represent anybody at all other than themselves.
And I want to offer a reflection on watching this sea change in how people think about food poverty. And that is, it didn't happen because of the monarchy. It didn't happen because of celebrity. It certainly didn't happen because of politicians. It did happen because of the church. But it didn't happen in silence, and it didn't happen by talking. It happened through action. And I think that that's been missing from this debate. Actually, there's something which I can't articulate, which is conscience is virtue in action. It's what you do rather than what you say.
One thing we haven't touched upon, and very much, is the press. To what extent is the church, and I'm talking about the church in general, not thought relevant, or is it the press doesn't think they're relevant? The press is very good at reporting when things go wrong. It hasn't got a great deal of interest in reporting some of the fairly good things that have been done.
I think that on the point made about the media, I think is absolutely crucial. I think the media have such a responsibility in increasing public religious literacy and understanding about religion.
I can hear the voice of my Muslim friends and colleagues saying that in many ways that the media is portraying Muslims, the vast majority of Muslims in this country is changing the dynamic. So journalists have a responsibility to tell the truth with all those things, courage and love and humility. And I am concerned that the way that Islam is often portrayed in Britain is creating a dynamic in and of itself, and it really worries me.
With the point that Anne made about the negativity of the media, and the media are negative about everything. They're not picking on the church or religious institutions. And I think there's, if you like, a wider and deeper problem.
The media has changed and religion has changed, and I think, if you like, they've become more and more difficult to hold in focus. The rate of the currency in journalism is the ripples on the surface. What's different today? What's sensational now? And the currency in religion is absolutely the opposite. It's very, very slow-moving currents deep beneath the surface.
What I'm interested in and want to reflect on is when people speak out now in our society, how quickly it is that the sort of basis of their speaking out is undermined enormously. And whilst I appreciate and need the importance of integrity, I wouldn't want my comments to be seen as a sort of negativity around integrity. But this sense that you can only speak out if you are completely pure about an issue, I find it very difficult.
And I'm really trying to find this cause and effect issue. Where is this loss of virtue coming from? And I wonder whether it's systemic, because it seems as if we talk about politicians, no matter how good that promising candidate is, seems to go into the system, and either he gets rejected or he gets corrupted by the system. Whether it's because I have the feeling that money and power these days are our reward systems and according to which we judge people. If we talk about success, it's not about does that person make a difference in other people's lives, it's about how much does someone earn.
I think economics has got a lot to do with the way public morality has deteriorated. We are now into 30 years, 25 years since the Big Bang in the city, promoted the idea that everybody is self-interested, everybody pursues their own interests, and that there is no wider consideration that we need bear in mind. The bottom line is what matters, profit, maximizing shareholder value, etc. Now, these ideas, if they were confined to the trading floor in Canary Wharf or the City of London, perhaps wouldn't be so dangerous except for the people involved. But they've escaped from there into the high street and become a universal ethic. So lots and lots of people now do believe it's right only to pursue your self-interest, to maximize your interest, to chase the bottom line, and not to look at the consequences of what you do on the wider society. And I think that fundamentally that is what is undermining virtue in society.
I sort of chart the tale of Mrs. Thatcher's own kind of nonconformist origins and how she enters Downing Street on a sort of nonconformist pledge to reinstill the values of thrift, the ideas of moral integrity, moral responsibility, the concept of the Protestant work ethic. You know, she enters Downing Street on a Puritan pledge, if you like, but creates a society that is completely at odds with the values she espouses. So we don't get a society based on thrift, we get a society completely consumed by credit and debt. We don't get a society more devout, but a society completely consumed by a new religion, you know, consumer capitalism.
Capitalism has done a lot more good than bad. Self-interest and the dynamism, it goes right back to Adam Smith and how you get your bread on your table through the self-interest of the baker, not his benevolence, and all that famous quotation. The challenge is that there are clearly parts of it that go badly wrong. There are some very bad people. There are people whose rewards are ludicrously excessive and who are cheat and dishonest. So if I can offer an atheist giving advice to a religious audience, find a moral language, a discourse in which you reconnect the advantages of self-interest, of capitalism, of markets, to a broader social view, so we can get win-win and not win-lose.
I think my final point I want to make, and I think we haven't sufficiently talked about it, though we've mentioned it, is that leadership is very, very widely spread through society. It's very diverse. We shouldn't, in my opinion, be looking for David Cameron or Justin Welby or the Queen to give us the answers to all of these questions. We should in ourselves be looking at how that operates in various ways. And I think that actually is a strength of our society, that we haven't got a kind of instant rule that is given down, but that we've all got to behave in that way. And my counsel, in terms, going back to the subject, where's the conscience of the nation, is for all the institutions to examine themselves from that point of view and see how in a variety of small ways they can advance the conscience of the nation by the actions of, as I say, literally millions of people throughout it. And so I think the conversation's been useful, even though perhaps not conclusive, and we didn't get an absolute answer to the question. And I'd like to thank all of you for your participation in this discussion.
Thank you.